everyone. My name is Tal Niv, and I'm the VP of Law and Policy at GitHub. Welcome to this session. It will be all about how tech policy is shaping the future of software, as you can see. Almost every day, we, as developers, as software companies, make news or wake up to news about some aspect of tech policy that directly affects us. Tough questions about the optimal tech policy arise all the time. GitHub and its policy team aim to make a meaningful contribution to those debates that shape all of our futures. This talk will try to explain what we refer to when we talk about tech policy. It will highlight recent policy debates, some of which are vital to software and to all of us. It would delve into GitHub's role in policy in terms of how we do policy, what we aim to achieve for all of us, and finally, it will contextualize our vision by walking us through a couple of current examples: the project's site policy and balanced employee IP agreement that we lovingly call BEPA. Both are in themselves examples for policy and policy-making processes. Finally, I'll end with a call for collaboration on policy matters that impact us all. So when we talk about tech policy, we mean much, much more than the thin layer of public policy. When we talk about tech policy, we mean the complex environments of laws, of regulations, of norms and standard practices, and the interplay with one another, within which developers build and ship software. These are all policies, whether their source is public or private, centralized or dispersed, that impact our work every day. We have to take them into account when we make design and resources decisions, when we ship, when we build, when we offer support services. At the end of the day, policies are there for their instrumental value and should be tuned to help us obtain optimal social outcomes. As technology continues to evolve and delivers new products and services into the market, it challenges the existing regulatory institutions and begs for changes. But the fact is that the best changes to policies are not always immediately apparent and almost never easily attainable. And wrong decisions can weigh heavily on us. For example, one policy that has led to good outcomes for us and developers as developers and as consumers is net neutrality. So let's just stare at it because it's so beautiful, and there's no other context to show it. This is the GIF that we produced for the net neutrality campaign just this year. As many of you know and enjoy, in 2015, the FCC established the Open Internet Order, which, among other things, prohibits ISPs from blocking or throttling access, or creating slow and fast lanes, paid prioritization. This policy that was put in place is what we commonly call network neutrality. What we are seeing now is the smashing sequel of the network neutrality debate of 2015 that ended then with the adoption of the Open Internet Order. Earlier this year, the FCC announced its intention to reverse that order. What would that mean for our work or for companies starting to offer online services? Well, it would allow ISPs to upcharge for fast access to their services, and it would allow incumbents to create barriers to entry and a difficult environment for smaller companies to compete. So humor me as I try to make a point about collective action, please. I hope I make it. So how many of you knew that this is happening? Show of hands. OK, very good. Good answer for the first question. How many of you think that taking away the Open Internet Order is perhaps not the optimal policy outcome? That's excellent, again. And how many of you have taken action to influence the policy outcome? OK, substantially less, right? Am I calling it right? So substantially less. And this is just one example of the collective action problem that the developers face. Policy issues that impact all of us are being discussed in different forums around the world right now. And we need to effectively voice our positions, or decision makers will not put in place instrumental public policy for all of us. Another example that I want to highlight, because it's so important, I don't know if you're all aware, but the EU is getting ready to vote on a copyright reform package. One of the measures on the table will require monitoring and filtering of anything that European citizens upload to information society services. Mind you, it's not all services. Not all of them are in scope. Just those that provide to the public access to large amounts of work. So, large and provide, I think that makes it all crystal clear. So, the article that spells out this part of the reform is the new Article 13 of the EU Copyright Directive that proposes to create a near automatic editorial responsibility of every form of content uploaded. And with that, fundamentally undermines the foundations upon which we build software today. So to prevent any copyright infringement, platforms that provide public access to code, like GitHub, would be compelled to put in place filtering technologies, no matter the fact that any existing ones are fundamentally flawed and ineffective, not to mention very, very expensive. Those filtering algorithms would ultimately decide what materials developers should be allowed to share, and as a result, every user would have their entire code monitored and potentially blocked from being uploaded. This proposal's motivation is driving content sharing platforms to enter into licensing deals with content publishers, which isn't practicable for many types of content, among which software. If it's implemented, it would narrow our steps and prevent developers from using specific software components and tools. It's not hard to see how this would lead to less competition and less innovation, less reliable software and less resilient software for all of us. So this slide that you just saw is part of the campaign that we contributed to. GitHub Policy contributed to it. We contribute content to it. And you can still sign it if you like. It has been submitted to the European Parliament, but it would still be effective if there are more voices that are heard on this matter. So there's still an opportunity. So other examples for how policy matters to us. So many of the previous iterations of this tech included a slide that contained references to impactful policy conversations, like GDPR, like CESTA, like the cybersecurity law that entered into effect in China earlier this year, like the Indian Supreme Court's decision about privacy as a fundamental right under the Indian Constitution, and other examples, it changed almost daily. So after going back and forth and figuring out what belongs on that slide and what doesn't, we realized that it might be more interesting and more insightful if I pointed out policy conversations related to Universe talks. So I swear, no, maybe I'm not swearing, or don't take me up on it, but I assure you that I could point out how every topic of every Universe talk is in part shaped by the policy environment, and even how it shapes the policy environment. And don't get me wrong, not saying that policy is the only story. Policy is not 100% determinative, but technology isn't either. So we need to remember that policy is there and impacts the outputs that we produce. So let me just exemplify the role that policy is taking in the talks where it's very, very near the surface. So the earliest session in this room, which I hope you did not miss, included a very interesting panel talk about how the regulated industries remain innovative despite having to meet strict compliance requirements. This talk made obvious that pre-existing policy becomes software policy when regulated industries, and all industries are regulated industries, some just more than others, but that regulated industries become software-driven. The pre-existing software shapes how they become software-driven, and software will surely shape the continued evolution of the policies that apply to them. Next example, happening today at 4. We all know that providers of SaaS to a diverse community of users have responsibilities around the safety of their products, right? Just as traditional software vendors do, just like toaster manufacturers do. The upcoming talk that is about to take place in this room again about platform balancing of identity and privacy makes apparent that in addition to the traditional responsibilities, SaaS platforms have responsibilities around the safety of the community of users, from themselves, from itself, and from external threats. In this sense, the service, an internet platform, the service that it's providing includes infrastructure and governance. In other words, a platform has government-like roles. The SaaS platform's policies shape the community and vice versa. And the platform's policies are shaped by public regulation and in turn contribute to shaping it. Tomorrow at 12, there's a talk about algorithmic biases in AI and machine learning. This talk is a great example of what happens when it's software itself that regulates. When this is the case, software becomes an even more contested site of policy, and calls for its regulation or for regulatory intervention for software and its human developers and users increase, whether it's in a private or a government setting. Software that replicates or reinforces or even mutates recognizably human biases, especially when used by a government or a government-like platform, becomes, or at least should become, heavily contested, something we should all be thinking about. Tomorrow at 4, there's a talk that discusses government use of open source as a means to encourage reliance on and contribution to open source by all of us. How the government uses software, how it procures, how it implements, how it maintains, how it creates, how it deploys software, is obviously a subject of policy. Also, over the long term, it helps determine what the government's capabilities are and how those capabilities are used to serve the public interest. Next example, and I want to mention Microsoft here. Again, this talk already took place. That was a previous talk in this room. Never mind, you missed it either way. I mentioned Microsoft and open source here because the talk freely admitted and even celebrated the fact that the company is changing views and practices on open source, which at times have been major parts of the public discourse on open source and innovation policy. No doubt that this change involved many internal debates and policy changes over the years in Microsoft, but also happened in tandem with broader industry acceptance of open source and shifts to cloud computing, showing how technology and policy discourse influence one another. So hopefully by now it's blatantly clear that policy outcomes for each ongoing debate goes to the heart of what we do. Sometimes they mean career or business success or lack of, and the term is who succeeds or fails. It could be developers, and it could also be lawyers, right? Not sure we're optimizing policy for lawyers. Could be incumbent companies, or it could be upstarters. Other times, policies mean more or less innovation, more or less censorship, more or less risk, and again, depends on for who. Sometimes they mean more or less equitable access to career and business success, to innovation, to speech, to control. Either way, policy decisions are directly impacting developers. From learning, from starting a company, from doing their day-to-day job, from contributing to open source, to powerfully shaping outcomes from the software revolution that developers are making. So some additional examples. Will your startup have to build automated content filters, hire an army of human monitors, or negotiate with incumbent right holders or authorities as a condition for building or providing the application and services that you really want to build? Can you bring your knowledge and skills, thus value, to new employers, to a new startup you found, to a new jurisdiction? Can you contribute to open source projects to build your skills or reputation? Do you have the opportunity to do genuinely interesting work? Is the industry innovative, or are your opportunities drastically curtailed? What price do you have to pay to keep your service running? How much do you have to pay patent trolls, to claimants of so-called API copyright? What compromises do you have to make to avoid being blocked in various places around the world? And can you keep your developers and your users safe? So, why do we think that it's supported that GitHub weighs in on all of those debates? As you've seen earlier, it takes a lot of resources to monitor for the impact of different policy conversations that are happening all over the world. Then analysis in itself takes a lot of resources and requires a broad reach. In addition, it's a fact that not all voices are the same in every conversation. If startups, small to medium companies, freelance developers don't organize to express a certain policy stance, the voices might not come through. But organization itself is very, very costly. Increasingly so because in the policy space, interests align in different ways on different issues. companies that host user-generated content might band together on speech moderation. And companies that rely primarily on advertising for revenue may have similar views on limitations on the right to privacy. Even within those policy areas, larger companies might have resources to manage some of these situations more than smaller companies do. And of course, sometimes there are reasons for different entities not to intervene on a given topic. The richness of the GitHub community and its use of our platform enable us to bridge across stakeholders with common interests as they arise. And when legislators and decision makers want to seek input from stakeholders, they often come to us to ask what our view is. This makes the value of having our own people speaking and educating on tech issues obvious. And finally, because policy outcomes are so essential to the day-to-day of developers, we've come to understand that driving favorable policy outcomes is part of providing GitHub the platform. Policy as a service, if you will. Which brings me to my next slide. So what are we doing? We're aiming towards policy optimization for developers in 3 distinct ways, which I think makes our efforts unique and interesting. Very unique and very interesting. First, we try to voice as effectively as possible the desirable policy outcome. In order to figure out what the best policy outcome is, we do an analysis of what different results would mean for our different users. We try to build coalitions with other similarly interested parties in civil society, and we try to build an optimal communication strategy. Second, and here we believe that we can make a large contribution, we do our best to dig deeper, to understand the proposed solutions on the table, to analyze the different alternatives, craft solutions and develop strategies to implement them, and explain everything to the different stakeholders. Third, and this point brings me to the final chapter of my presentation, we make a genuine effort to drive new standards and best practices in our role as private regulators, equipped with the understanding that developers operate in policy space with layers of public and private regulation. So on that third point, I want to elaborate on the relationship between driving new standards and best practices in our role as private regulators and our aspirations for public policy. Properly implemented and adopted, standards and best practices serve as industry self-regulation of both substantive matters and transparency. These reduce the need for aggressive and possibly bad public regulation. Bad, I mean, is extremely costly, not achieving its intended outcomes, or subject to capture. Good self-regulation lights the path for further self-regulation innovation. And because policy regulation is deeply informed by how industry best practices and standards work, good self-regulation also increases the probability of good public regulation. And platforms are a very good example of this. Their self-regulation informs the debate over the role of private platforms that provide government-like services in society and contributes to those platforms' legitimacy. Note that another hot topic that complements platform regulation is algorithmic regulation. Indeed, it is hard to separate the two. Algorithms always work in some policy influence context, often on platforms. Platform policies mediate relationship between users and employees as much as with platform software. And so policy transparency is a form of algorithmic transparency and vice versa. So now examples for how we exercise our responsibility to drive new standards and to put in place policies and processes of policy making. I'd like to discuss 2 examples that we're all very proud of projects that have been open sourced this year. The second of the 2 examples that I'm going to talk about is the Balanced Employee IP Agreement. Again, as I mentioned earlier, its nickname is BEPA, and you're free to use it. My first example is a project that we call Site Policy. So to prove to you that these projects exist, there are the projects. Feel free to take a look in your spare time, or now, whenever you like. So earlier this year, we open sourced 21 policies that mediate relationships with our site users and call the project Site Policy. I think it's a very fitting name. In other words, we've open sourced the governing documents for how we regulate our platform. Those policies were, of course, public, but as we know, merely public material isn't open source. Either in definition, it's not provided in editable form with permissions to edit and reuse, or in process. It doesn't live in the public repo, it doesn't have issues, it doesn't have pull requests or active maintainers or all of the above. So we did all of that. And yes, not surprisingly, we did get substantially more engagement from the community than before. And it made us think much harder about changes to our terms of service than before. These were both hoped-for outcomes. We believe the GitHub platform and our user community are much stronger as a result. It's a well-studied fact that most users don't read terms of service that they accept to use a platform. The minority that does in fact read them might raise issues that would get resolved one way or another without the knowledge of the other users of the platform. In site policy, those issues can be raised and addressed publicly by the GitHub legal team that maintains that repository. And the access to all those debates and their resolution is open and continuous. So GitHub now has been around for close to 10 years. It had time to develop policies, and it has resources to do so and to continue to do so. A new platform that is now getting built can come to site policy to get an idea about the policies that GitHub found to be needed, and to see what GitHub considers a good approach about the content of the repo. Sometimes, when a platform needs to adopt a policy, the policies that site policy contains can be used with all the necessary and appropriate edits, of course. Still helpful. We believe that over the next decade, adoption and iteration on these policies by other platforms will make our industry stronger, not least by contributing to the industry's legitimacy, trust, and transparency. The other policy endeavor that we undertook this year is the Balanced Employee Intellectual Property Agreement project, or, as I called it earlier, BEPA, less of a mouthful. So as part of the description of site policy, I just spoke of platform policies that mediate relationships with users. What about policies that mediate relationships with employees and contractors? Employment is heavily regulated, and such regulation clearly shapes the opportunities and conditions available for work, for all of us. Employment policy impacts not only the conditions at any one employer, but the ability of workers to move among employers, to work on non-employment projects, to found their own companies. In the new Cognitive Property, you should read that paper, Human Capital Law and the Reach of Intellectual Property, Orly Lobel documents how knowledge, experience, creativity, and network are all becoming subject to commodification and litigation, contractually mediated by IP assignments and non-compete, non-solicitation, non-dealing, and non-poaching agreements that ultimately suppress innovation and harm career opportunities. Smart companies and workers can change their arrangements to optimize for innovation, and more on that in a moment. I just want to underline that this is an important public policy issue, if it's not clear. These kinds of agreements are now being used to restrict the mobility of many professions, including fast food workers, not just developers. And they exist in a variable public policy context. The non-enforceability of non-compete contracts and resulting rapid knowledge diffusion in California has been a widely studied factor behind the emergence of Silicon Valley, first pointed out in 1994. GitHub's IP agreement goes further than the California default law in optimizing for innovation. In particular, it recognizes that device ownership is a blunt and unnecessary way to assign control over IP. When it was being developed, our goal was to have an agreement that acknowledges how developers actually work and that minimizes creative friction. BEPA was started as a reusable version of GitHub's employee IP agreement, named for what we believe is its balanced approach to assigning control of intellectual property that is created by an employee. A company using BEPA doesn't try to claim control of a developer's free time knowledge production, nor does it try to extend company control past the period of employment. We were and are continuously aware that IP ownership is a topic that is close to developers' hearts, since it impacts their mobility as employees, their ability to found startups, and their ability to contribute to open source. We were and are also continuously aware that IP ownership is close to companies' hearts. It is definitely close to ours. We're continuing to develop this project, and we hope to find even more balance, even more win-win, that keeps control and freedom to operate that companies need, while further optimizing for innovation within companies and the industry. And we know that societies and industries prosper when there is clear and fair, and therefore efficient and legitimate property ownership and high labor autonomy and mobility. Employer control or attempt to control of all IP created by employees, even created during their free time and not related to the business, sets up conflict, is perceived as unfair, not surprisingly, and has employees and their ideas trapped. Broad adoption of BEPA should have similar beneficial effects for the communities and industries in which BEPA is adopted. And it should have this effect because it encourages disruptive innovation exactly where it wants to occur, at margins of the day-to-day work, driven by passion and by curiosity. This is good regulation that serves the industry's reputation, forestalls bad regulation, and lights a path towards good public regulation. And we know that developers feel and understand all of this. This is the all-time #1 Hacker News item about GitHub. And IP agreements, non-competes, and other mobility and contribution restrictions are hot-button topics that require expertise to untangle, and that not much progress has been made on, despite the compelling role mobility and knowledge diffusion has had in the making of Silicon Valley. And you might wonder if optimizing innovation policy faces collective action problems too. I think the answer is yes. Perhaps that can be overcome with leadership and increased collaboration. We certainly hope so. So, BEPA is just one example of the type of impact that GitHub and its policy team intends to generate as we move towards the future of software. Our policy team strives to innovate on policies that push private companies and tech industry standards forward, while taking on a critical role in educating our community and customers on key policy issues that are impacting software. Together, we can build and activate coalitions comprising various stakeholders to inform policymakers on these emerging issues that shape our industry and ultimately society. We can ensure that we maintain an open and free internet. We can engage in emerging debates in Europe, like around Article 13, as we discussed earlier, like around GDPR, like around other forms of platform regulation. And we can rethink our values, our rights, and mitigating biases as GitHub, our community, and customers deepen our work in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and automation. So, now that I've said everything that there is to say, I'm sure that you're convinced that it's a lot of work. So if you're interested in getting involved and collaborating with us, or if you have any thoughts that you would like to share, please reach out to us. This is the email, or to me. Please reach out to me. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all. Thank you. Any answers? Anything? Answers, hopefully. Yes, Paul.
Are there tools that software developers can help build to make this work easier?
Yes, oh, definitely. I'm so glad that you asked that. So even around the network neutrality discussion, we were hosting a bunch of tools that were used for the battle to create assets, to place them where they need to go. We were very proud of that role that we took in that campaign because that was unique to us, the fact that we could offer these tools and to make sure that they gain traction. So yes, definitely, and I can't see a debate where that won't be true. Definitely, there's always tools that can be built to just boost every fight like this and every discussion. Anything else? Yes?
So when you're talking about employee, like, intellectual property rights, oh, thanks. I was like, who's coming at me? When you're talking about employee intellectual property rights and you're saying that doesn't have to do with their work, are you saying like if it's happening during work time, how are you designating like this is work IP, this is employee IP, this is totally separate?
So I encourage you to take a look at the repository to see how we found a solution to that question, among others, because it's a very tough question. That's exactly what companies think about when they draft those agreements. And that's why often the solution is either to leave things ambiguous and then to see what happens. And we don't think that that's a good decision. Sometimes there's a decision to draw the boundary someplace, and we think that that's better. That place needs to be the right place. So take a look at what we have in the repository and see if you think that it makes sense. As I said, that is the point of the repository, to continue iterating, to find solutions where they weren't found before. So would love to hear if you think that that the boundary is placed at the right place. And obviously, different companies have different needs, different employees have different needs. And so I think that the work that we've done conveys that too. Any other question? Yes?
It was neat that you had repositories in the open for those sort of things.
Yes.
Do you have anything for, like, I guess, either law firms or anyone who has to work basically in private, other than like GitHub Enterprise, or some of the tooling that you use to collaborate internally as, I guess, lawyers, basically, or like, policy makers? Do you have a place where you talk about some of your tooling? Or like, I know GitHub has their engineering blog where they talk about software. Is there a place to talk about law software?
Yes.
Yeah.
So great question, and it's so great because tomorrow there's a talk that you should all go to about the legal team's use of GitHub. It's given by 2 colleagues of mine, and it's going to talk about how we use GitHub for our internal legal needs. And certainly there are different use cases that require private repositories and private work, but GitHub allows for that, and you'll hear all about that and the processes on top of that tomorrow if you come. Now, law firms are a different story, obviously. There are many reasons. Some of them have to do with the profit model, to keep things in private, not make them public. And so, different parties make different choices. And obviously, there are many reasons. But tomorrow's conversation will also touch upon that. So thank you for the question. I hope I answered it. Anyone else? No? OK, well, thank you again. And this was a real pleasure. Please talk to us. Please email policy@github.com, or to me personally, Tal Niv, very creative, @github.com. Thank you.